Swap partition size on a 64 GB RAM computer for memory-intensive work. I have 64 and NBSP GB RAM and 240 and NBSP GB SSD on my computer, which I'm going to use for memory-intensive calculations, machine learning, data mining, etc. Most of the advice I found on the internet are about 248 and NBSP GB RAM computers, and they recommend 2x the size of the RAM swap partition, so 128 and NBSP GB. Is it reasonable to make a 128 and NBSP GB swap partition? What advantages do I get by making a huge swap partition? Do I understand correctly that, in case I run out of physical RAM, if I have no swap, I get an out-of-memory error? If I do have swap, some of RAM pages will be copied to swap partition, and the program will continue to run, although more slowly. Some people say it's a bad idea to make swap on SSD, since it has limited amount of read/write cycles. How fast using swap would exhaust SSD read/write cycles? As far as I know, it's about 50,000 write IOPS. I'm using Linux, Ubuntu 14.04, trusty tar. Going to set a 16 and NBSP GB swap for now, as it should be surely enough. For example, Red Hat suggests 4 and NBSP GB and 16 and NBSP GB of disk space isn't actually a big deal.
You probably only need a small amount of swap. When you have sufficient RAM for your computer's typical working set, which I'm pretty sure you do, you only need swap for two things. You need swap to get information that will likely never be accessed out of RAM to free up more space for disk cache. Many applications run on system startup and will never be accessed again. You don't want any pages they dirtied stuck in RAM forever. So you need swap to hold them. You need swap to cover allocations that will never be filled. This space simply has to be available, even though it will not be used. Without it, the system will have to refuse to allocate memory even when it has plenty of free physical RAM because it has insufficient backing store to permit all of its allocations to be used at once. Neither of these requires a large amount of swap. 16 GB, for example, should be more than enough. The purpose is not to let you run bigger working sets at the cost of speed. The purpose is to let you use your 64 GB effectively and not have to clog it with junk or reserve it for edge cases that will never happen. I agree with Bert that 4 GB is quite likely to be sufficient.
Red Hat recommends 4 and NBSP GB on a machine with 64 and NBSP GB. However, sizing swap is more of an art than a science. It depends on what the machine is being used for, how much disk space and memory you have, and other factors. Remember, you can always add more swap later. Using the 2x physical memory rule is outdated with the amount of memory systems have these days. But running with 0 swap is not recommended unless you know what you are doing. The recommendation of 4 and NBSP GB is a good starting point.
On Linux, you need enough swap so that the total virtual memory available, RAM plus swap, is enough for all the processes you want to run at once and their maximum virtual footprint. If you have less swap than this, or no swap at all, then the following situation happens: the system runs out of memory trying to allocate a page. But, this is still a soft failure even though there is no swap, because the system has plenty of victim pages that can be removed in order to make room, namely, the pages of all file-backed memory mappings, such as executables and shared libraries. As your system demands more and more space for data, which cannot be swapped out, it will increasingly evacuate the executable code, shared libraries and executables, leading to terrible thrashing, as the working set is trimmed into a tighter and tighter set of pages. Swap space softens this problem by providing a place for anonymous, not file-mapped, pages to be swapped out, the pages used for memory allocations, so that executable code can stay in memory. Even so, if you don't frequently run memory-intensive tasks, you may be able to get away with running swapless most of the time, and manually configure a swap file, instead of a dedicated partition, when you need it. To make a swap file on the fly, become root and when you don't need it anymore. Notes? You definitely do not need to configure at least as much swap as you have RAM. This rule of thumb dates back to operating systems where it was a hard requirement due to the way swapping was designed. There are ways to make Linux fail hard when no memory is available, namely via manipulating the values of these sysctl entries.
There are more considerations. If you need /1 suspend to work, then you need at least the size of your RAM and then some. However, it sounds unlikely you need it given that you seem to mainly build a computational workhorse. In this case, please consider using a swap file instead of a partition. You don't need to worry about sizing much, getting rid of or adding it later doesn't require any repartitioning. There is no noticeable performance penalty using a file over a partition. If you ever happen to need it, have a look at the size, and this will then also give you good hints.
If you want to support the channel, please consider subscribing.